All right. How's everyone doing today? We are going to discuss reforms from the Industrial Revolution. These reforms are specifically in England first, but then we're going to see a lot of them kind of transfer over onto the continent as well eventually. So, the first thing I want you to do, quick conversation with your partner, recall and describe the conditions of the early industrial revolution with your partner, and do more than just bad, like get some detail here. And I think an important thing to think about now, knowing those conditions, is who wanted reforms, who wanted to fix things. Um, so basically, political reforms, everybody wanted it, unless you were a landowner because they controlled everything. And socially and housing and work conditions, everybody except factory owners wanted things fixed. So if we take a look at this social tension chart, which we've looked at a couple times here, we're kind of living in this neighborhood right now, as far as when we're talking about in England. So again, the top is outright revolution. So we talked about revolutions of 1830 yesterday. Even though we talked about in England, they weren't quite as bad, but we'll get to that in a minute here. So I guess the next question I want you to talk about with your partner is, why are things so bad right now? Why are things so tense in England? Where is the conflict? So again, this is another way kind of contextualizing this conversation. So be specific. What are the issues people have with what's going on right now? Go ahead. I have four, by the way, four different big issues. So go ahead, see what you can come up with. All right. So one is obviously what you already talked. Where'd I go? Hit a button there. All right. So one is obviously what you were just talking about. The workers want reforms. The working class wants reforms because of the conditions in the factories and in their homes where they live. Um, we have this conflict between the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, and the Tories and the old landed money. So there's conflict there because factory owners have a lot of money, but they don't have as much influence as they would like right now. I think another reason why these ideas are, or why things are so tense, is because there's a lot of liberal ideas circulating and formulating. And then there's kind of a potpourri of other reasons also. Hopefully, you brought up the corn laws and what that does and who that helps and who it doesn't. The fact that only 8% of the people have the right to vote, the rotten boroughs. So these are some things we've talked about. So these are some economic and some political issues that we're having here. So again, this is the number of people who can vote in England pre 1832. So 400,000 people out of a population of 400 or of 14 million. Get there, numbers are hard. Um, and so very small electorate. And then we talked about the rotten boroughs. They're a parliamentary borough that has very small or non-existent electorate and it's basically dominated by a handful of wealthy individuals. And so these are some problems here. Um, I want to take another look. You looked at this cartoon for the DBQ. Now that you know the DBQ that we did before with finals, now that you know what rotten boroughs are a little bit more, see if you can just interpret the cartoon a little bit more. So go ahead with your partner and talk about the interpretation of this cartoon. And then, as we said, you've got the corn laws, which is artificially inflating the price of bread, so of all food for people, and only benefiting the landowners, the Tory landowners. And so that's making things real tense. And then we also had the Peterloo massacre, if you remember that. I want you to take a moment and talk with your partner. What were they there for? What were the people there for, and what happened, and why was this such a big deal for England? Look, by the way, is that a bonnet rouge? Just saying. And then, as we talked about yesterday, we had all those revolutions in 1830. The big one in Paris, in Belgium, in Warsaw. And then we did talk about the little riots that were in England also. Again, not the extent to which we saw on the continent. But this is adding to that tension. So this is adding to, the reason there's these social tensions, why things are so high. And England feels it. England feels the pressure of all of these things happening. And even the government, which is really far removed from the majority of the people, they are feeling it. And so we are going to get the Reform Act of 1832. This is going to widen the electorate. This is going to fix some of the rotten boroughs. So this is going to fix some of the worst excesses in the political issues that England feels it's having right now. This is just such a cool map. I just love this map, and it's such an old soul type of map. So basically, it's just showing different types of reforms that they did, fixing the boroughs, fixing some of the constituencies, changing some of them up. I just like the way this one looks. This one probably is a better one to look at. Places that are changed, extended, new boroughs that are created to kind of basically address the realities of the Industrial Revolution, of the population changes of the Industrial Revolution. It also is going to increase the number of people who can vote. So here is the pre-1832. This is before this big, huge reform package. And then the change that comes in afterwards is here. So it went from 400,000 people to 650,000 dudes. Basically 1 out of every 6 adult males. And you had to have property that was valued at 10 pounds or more. So again, this is the big reform bill that they did. Pretty astounding, isn't it? So this is basically going to be extending to the upper middle class and smaller landowners. This reform bill does not extend suffrage to the working class. The working class still does not have the vote. The vast majority of people still do not have the vote, as you can clearly see. But it did extend it. It did extend suffrage. And probably the most important part of this conversation is this showed that social change could come through Parliament. It demonstrated to England that they didn't have to resort to revolution, that it didn't have to get that bad, and Parliament could bring about changes. And so that in itself, even if this isn't nearly as dramatic as we'd like it to be, that itself is a very big deal. Okay. So next is a part that isn't in your reading at all, and we're going to see the emergence of new political parties, okay? And these political parties are going to be, in the words of the College Board, mass-based political parties become vehicles for reform. And so as we are expanding the suffrage, as more and more people are getting involved in politics, these political parties are going to have to adjust to that reality and figure out how to meet the needs of their constituents. And so what we see is the old political party were the Whigs and the Tories. And what we get now is the liberal Whigs join up with the radicals, and they create the Liberal Party. That's fairly convenient to know that, right? And then your Tories, who is your old money, they're your landowners, they join up with the more conservative Whigs, and they create, conveniently, the Conservative Party. So we have liberal and conservative. Okay? All right. Now what I want you to do is, if you could get handed out the Reform in England sheet, and it's got everybody's the faces on the back here, the little box. You're going to do the who would have said it on this side. I don't know why that's blurry and won't come into view there. But you're going to do this side here. Okay? Oh, there it is. I was just trying to zoom in on a face. So you're going to do that side with your partner. Do the best you can, and then we will actually talk about that tomorrow when I get back. Okay? This isn't the only reform that is passed in this era. This is an era of reform for England. In 1833, they abolished slavery totally. The slave trade had been abolished since 1808, so going back quite a bit, going back to the Napoleonic era. But England was still profiting off the slave trade, as they, had been for the last 300 years. But in 1833, they became the first European country, I should say, to abolish slavery. And so this is a big deal. England likes to take a lot of credit for it, saying they were the first to abolish the slave trade and abolish slavery. And I guess they should get some credit where credit is due there. But basically, they had made their fortune off of it for the last 300 years. And so I don't want to give them too much credit for that. But that is a pretty big deal. And moving forward, obviously, it's going to have a positive impact on millions of people's lives. The following year, they passed the New Poor Laws. I call this kind of a reform, in that they're trying to use public money to help people out. But really what it was doing was continuing to punish the poor. Relief was only given in poorhouses, and you had to work for it. And so it really kind of is a continuation of some of those other poor laws that we talked about at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But they are, in their view, it was a reform. And then a couple of years later, in a boon for freedom of the press, newspapers were allowed to report on how members of Parliament in the House of Commons voted. And so members of Parliament were now being held accountable because their voting was on the public record. And that's a pretty big deal. Next, I want to take a minute and talk about the Chartists here. We've kind of been talking about the Chartists every once in a while. They've popped up. We read one of their documents earlier in the Industrial Revolution unit that we did. So basically, the Chartists were wanting changes to the House of Commons, changes in voting rights, expanded suffrage. And they're called Chartists because they were passing around this charter that they wanted. And they were getting people all over the country to sign it. Supposedly, it was eventually signed by over 1 million people. And essentially, Parliament just said, no, thanks. We're not going to take a look at it. We don't want to hear this, which I think is showing the limit of some of the reforms that Parliament wants to do, as far as the political reforms that they're doing. And so this Chartist movement was a really big, it's mass involvement. Oops, sorry, wrong button there. This is showing mass involvement in politics. Even if ultimately their voices aren't heard, the people are getting involved. People are getting more engaged in politics. And so that door opening is a pretty significant one. So now your reading talked about some of the factory acts, but before we get into the actual factory acts, what I want to do is talk about who is passing these reforms, because I think that's a really important part of this. So who of our new political parties do you think is more likely to be pushing for reform in the factories? Would it be the Liberals or would it be the Conservatives? I feel like our instinct usually is to go with it'd be the Liberals because they want to reform and help the workers. But in reality, the Conservatives are the ones who are pushing for reforms. And the reason they're doing that is because who are the Liberals? The Liberals are your factory owners. They don't want these reforms. These reforms are going to cost them money. So, of course, the Conservatives are pushing for these reforms because they want votes, right? They want the working class to vote for them, right? No, because don't forget the working class still doesn't have the right to vote. So they're doing this out of legitimate concern and care for the working people. I guess maybe if you'd like that idea, we could say that's happening. But more accurately, they're doing it to screw over the Liberals. The Liberals have money, they have wealth, they have influence, and they're hoping these factory acts are going to gain them some street cred, gain the Conservatives some street cred, and limit the wealth and influence that the Liberals have. So they're actually pushed by Conservatives. So the early factory reform acts are 1833 and 1842, which basically limits the number of hours that kids can work in and sets factory condition standards and inspection standards. In 1847, they passed the 10 Hours Act, which limits a day to 10 hours, a work day to 10 hours for anybody. So we start seeing some real change in people's lives, some real substantial change in people's lives. But there's still one big law kind of hanging over everybody here. And this is the Corn Laws. And so the repeal of the Corn Laws is a really big, important moment in our story. So the Corn Laws are being fought against by the liberals because the liberals are factory owners and they don't make any money off the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws hurt them. The Corn Laws hurt their workers. And so they want to get the Corn Laws repealed because that'll screw over the conservatives, who are the landowners. So see, this is politics, kids. See how this goes. And so there's some very organized efforts. There's a group cleverly called the Anti-Corn Law League. Not a great name, right? Doesn't really pop, not really pop on a bumper sticker. But the Anti-Corn Law League, that's demonstrating mass participation in politics. The liberals are getting people fired up. They're getting people out to demonstrations, out to meetings. They're hanging up posters. They're having demonstrations. And so this is a very big idea. This is a very big movement. And I think what it's important to understand is this is the industrialists and the working class. Hold on one sec. All right, so this was, as I was saying, the industrialists and the working class against the landowners. And keep in mind, the landowners have been the dominant group in England forever, really, since the Glorious Revolution. They've been the group. And so the fact that by 1846 they get the Corn Laws repealed, which takes that tariff off, this is a huge victory against the landowners. England is now fully committed to being an industrial country rather than an agricultural country. And this is going to be a really big turning point. And so there's actually some really important results of the Corn Laws being repealed that I got to make sure that you get here. And so the first one is that the industrialists are the new governing power. They are the power. They are the influence. It's no longer the landowners. So the industrialists, they are the new political power. They are the new governing power in this group. But now, because the Corn Laws are repealed, it's no longer profitable for anybody really to grow grain in England, to grow wheat in England. It's going to be cheaper to import it. And so England now becomes dependent on imports. So that's our second point here. England becomes dependent on imports. And because of that, this is kind of a subheading of that, they are now committed to international free trade. They want free trade because they need to import grain to feed their people. They can't feed their people by themselves. They need to import grain. So they're committed to international free trade. And because of that, they want to be able to control the seas to make sure they can allow free trade to keep happening. So facilitate free trade. So they want control of the seas, which goes back to our maxim of England. Why? More boats. This idea that the industrialists are the new governing power, these ideas that the industrialists are the new governing powers, that they are reliant on imports. Because they're reliant on imports, they want international free trade. And because they want international free trade, they want to be able to control the seas to facilitate that. This is going to dominate England's politics and their foreign policy all the way through World War II. So even though we're way back in 1846 here, this idea of having international free trade is going to be the defining feature of England for the next century. So, last part I want you to do is to go back to this sheet, the sheet you did the who would have said this, but look at the other side and just kind of read through the reforms in England side. I don't know if you can see that at all. I don't know if this works. It doesn't look like it does. And just kind of take a look at it. And talk about what that tells you about government involvement in people's lives. And then also, does that fix it? Do you think these reforms basically fix the issues that that England were going to have? Did the repeal of the Corn Laws, did this list of reforms, did the Reform Bill of 1832, did that fix the problems? So after you have that conversation, then you can go ahead and take a look at the readings, the Springtime for the People, 1848, or the document activity, or at least we can have those handed out. And yeah, I will see you guys when we get back. Thank you for being so awesome and doing wonderful at this. You guys are the best.